Let's start with this Ukrainian attack on Sevastopol and the attack on civilians. And we've learned that the Ukrainian government is talking about these are not civilians, these are civilian occupiers in that region. This is unbelievable what's going on. How do you find it? How do you find this type of tactic? We cannot call it strategy. It can be a tactic.
Well, there is no strategy, obviously. There's no war termination strategy. There's no feasible goal for what we are doing with Ukraine at the moment. I think the argument that these are civilian occupiers is laughable. If you apply that to Israel, what does that mean? Again, this is an example of double standards and hypocrisy, which has no persuasive value at all. But this is a very dangerous thing. Imagine, for example, that somebody in Cuba, 90 miles away from Miami, had fired a missile with cluster bombs at Miami Beach and killed a lot of kids and injured a lot of people. What do you suppose the United States would do? I think the Russians have been very restrained throughout this war. Unfortunately, however, this attack, coming on top of the release of Ukrainian weapons to be fired deep into Russia, and the forthcoming provision of F-16s to the Ukraine, what this has done has inevitably led to counter-escalation from Russia. And the good news is that President Putin has, for the time being, ruled out the use of nuclear weapons to respond. But he has made it clear that that is an option. And what we are seeing is a phased, graduated response by Russia. The immediate response is to arm the enemies of the United States and the allies of Ukraine wherever he can. That is the explanation for the sudden reversal of Russian policy on North Korea. The Russians had always been against North Korean nuclear weapons program. They stood with Japan, South Korea, the United States, and China in the six-party talks, trying to persuade North Korea not to develop nuclear weapons. Some time ago, in response to the increasing enmity of the United States, they apparently transferred missile ICBM technology to North Korea. North Korea now has intercontinental ballistic missiles that can deliver a nuclear warhead anywhere in the United States. And when Mr. Putin was in Pyongyang, he deepened the commitment to North Korea. He then went to Vietnam to restore Russian influence there, which had been somewhat eclipsed. Russian influence in Vietnam historically was very considerable. Even during the French period, the Russian fleet that traveled to the Tsushima Strait and was sunk by the Japanese Imperial Navy in 1904, refueled and refreshed itself at Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam, then under the French, of course. I don't suppose China is very happy about either of these developments. The Chinese relationship with North Korea remains somewhat tense, although the Chinese value North Korea as a buffer between them and US forces in South Korea. And the relationship with Vietnam has a 2,000-year history of difficulty. The Vietnamese are very good at managing their relationship with China. They've learned the hard way how far they can go and when they must pull up and stop. And now, of course, they have the ability to compete to draw on competition between the United States and Russia, as well as competition between the United States and China. So they have put themselves in a very nice position. Where else will Mr. Putin turn up? I think it's entirely possible we will see Russian arming of Venezuela, for example, or perhaps Bolivia, or maybe Nicaragua, or, the enemies of the United States are not limited to the old world. The new world, the Western Hemisphere, also contains countries that are very resentful of American pressure on them. So I think this is a phased, graduated response. We have not seen the end of it. And I would just conclude by saying that, we have drawn repeated red lines. We will not do this. We will not do that in Ukraine. And then we have gone and done it. And the same has been true of the Russians, because every escalation on the part of the West has been met with a comparable counter-escalation from Russia. And I don't think we have seen the end of this. So for now, we are seeing a rather nasty but conventional response to things like the Sevastopol beach massacre. But I don't think it's going to stop there. And history suggests that we could very well cross the nuclear threshold at some point. So this is a very serious matter. And I think it is absurd for people in the United States and elsewhere in the West to imagine that Mr. Putin is bluffing. I have not seen any evidence of him bluffing. And I would say he has been portrayed as a madman. If he is indeed insane, then you should pay attention to his warnings. If he is not insane, if he is, as I believe, cold and calculating and careful with his words, that is also a reason to take him seriously. And declaring that he doesn't mean what he says, or he doesn't know what he's doing, is foolish.
Yeah, what's so important about this attack? It seems that they were attacking from Odessa. They were using the bases from Odessa. They were attacking Sevastopol. And this would bring the question of Odessa again to the mind of Russians. We know that recently Putin, with his preconditions, he didn't mention anything about Odessa. He said, we are going to talk about these regions that are already in the hand of Russians.
Well, I think when you and I have discussed this before, I have told you that my main concern is that Russian successes on the battlefield might lead Mr. Putin to move the goalposts. And originally, he was trying to defend the rights of Russian speakers in the Donbass. Did not include Kherson and Zaporizhia. They are now within his set of objectives, because, of course, he controls only part of these oblasts. Part of them remain in Ukrainian hands. But there is a concern that Odessa, which is historically a Russian city, might also become an objective for the Russian armed forces. It's very hard to take Odessa, I think, because Russia is not equipped to do a seaborne landing, an amphibious landing, and in fact, it has lost portions of its Black Sea fleet to Ukrainian attacks, aided and abetted apparently by the British. But it's also hard to get across the Dnieper River and come down from the north, which is in effect the only way you can take, the Russians can hope to take Odessa. That would be a big development if it happened. But at the moment, nobody's talking to the Russians. We've had a phone call between the American Secretary of Defense and the Russian Defense Minister, but it appears to have been an empty call, much like the US calls with the Chinese, where we talk and we don't listen. So there is no real communication. I hope that's not the case. I think what is happening is nowhere good news for Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians have taken huge losses in the last, 28 months now, since this war began. And there's no respite in sight.
Yeah. We know that after this visit of Putin to North Korea in the mainstream media in the West, Le Monde, CNN, Voice of America, they're talking about many outlets. They're talking about she's not happy with this visit of Putin. Do you find any sort of disagreement between Xi and Putin in North Korea?
Historically, the Chinese and the Russians have been rivals. The Korean conflict itself, that is the war that followed North Korea's invasion of South Korea on June 25th, 1950, was mainly fought by the Russians until the Chinese themselves were forced to intervene. And I note the Chinese intervention because in many ways what is happening with the firing of missiles into Russian territory, it reminds me of General Douglas MacArthur's confidence that the Chinese were bluffing. They would not enter the war in Korea because we were so powerful, this would do terrible damage to them. And in fact, he was entirely wrong about that. And 50,000 Americans died as a result. The Chinese army, which was then very battle-hardened, but very primitive, more than held its own on the Korean Peninsula. The Russian army is now battle-hardened. And I think we should not assume that history will not repeat itself. When you charge the other side with a bluff, and it is not bluffing, you can pay a very heavy price. Now, on the Korean-Chinese relationship, as I said, China has an interest in North Korea as a buffer state because the United States has roughly 30,000 troops in South Korea and a history of invading the North, albeit in response to a North Korean attack. North Korea developed nuclear weapons over Chinese opposition. The Chinese have not had a military presence in North Korea since 1957, I believe. And the relationship has often been very tense. Chinese probably agree with the late Nikita Khrushchev's comment about, it was actually a comment about Mao's China, but he called it pantsless communism. And I think that probably applies. The Chinese would agree that is what North Korea has been. They don't admire it. And the North Koreans, of course, are very mindful of Korean history. Korea has been invaded 72 times in its history, almost always from the north, from China, from what is now China. Of course, it may not have been China when the invasions occurred. It might have been another ethnic group in what is now the Chinese Northeast, maybe other Koreans, maybe Manchus. And there have also been Japanese invasions, and of course, American invasions and so forth and so on. So, but the North Koreans always have their eye on the Yalu River and what might come over it from China. So this is not an easy relationship. The North Korean border with Russia is much smaller. I think it's about 16 miles. Maybe those are kilometers. Perhaps I've got that wrong. The Russians have had a supportive relationship rather than a domineering relationship with North Korea from its inception. Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, was an officer in the Soviet Army. And so these ties are quite deep. The Chinese have a long border with Russia. They have settled that border. At the moment, the relationship is good, but it is not an alliance. It is not a requirement for Russia to coordinate with China when it does things with North Korea. And it's quite independent. And this is a reminder, this is an entente. It is a limited partnership for limited purposes. It is not NATO. It is not US-Japan Security Treaty. China, for its part, probably, like the Russians, would find it to be in its interest to talk to the other side, to tell the Russians what it's going to do before it does it. And of course, Mr. Putin was just in Beijing. So we can assume that during that visit, he talked with Xi Jinping about his plan to prop up North Korea. I guess the final observation would be that the war in 1950 began. The Chinese were quite reluctant to approve it. It was Stalin who agreed with Kim Il-sung to invade South Korea. He assured Mao Zedong the Russians would back China to the hilt. They didn't do it. And that, in fact, was one of the points of argument between Moscow and Beijing back in the mid-50s, that the Russians had not kept their word. So this is a complicated situation, and we have stupid people who know nothing arguing that North Korea is a satellite of China, or now they will say it's a satellite of Russia. No, it's very, very independent. It always has been. And everybody who has dealt with it has always found it very difficult to deal with. And China and Russia are no exception. So I think this is much more complicated than people imagine.
Yeah. The other thing, we know that Prime Minister of India is going to be in Russia talking with Vladimir Putin. And Lavrov was saying that they're trying to strengthen their relationship among Russia, China, and India. We know that China and India have some sort of tensions. And how do you see this attempt on the part of Russians to bring all of them together?
Well, there's a history, actually, of Russian peacemaking in South Asia. The former Prime Minister Shastri of India died in Tashkent during a Russian mediation of Indo-Pakistani difficulties. The Russians have had a role in South Asia, which, of course, the British opposed during the imperial days, but they've had a role in South Asia for much of the last century, for almost 100 years. So this is not unusual. India is a very independent country. It does not want to align itself with anyone. Yes, it has a persistent border conflict with China, and it has armed itself appropriately against China. I don't think the Chinese are very worried about India, but India seems to be quite worried about China. In any event, to the extent that Russia has influence on China, which it may, it's in India's interest to court Russia even more than in the past. And finally, I would remind you that we are talking about, and I do this with some deference because you're in Brazil, but we're talking about the BRICS, which is under Russian chairmanship, which is going to have a meeting in Kazan, which is working on various projects, including ways of bypassing the dollar for trade settlement. And India and Russia have a ruble to rupee exchange relationship. So there's a lot to talk about. Unfortunately, from the point of view of Washington, a lot of what they want to talk about is not very good news for the United States.
Yeah. As you mentioned, we're going to have in October, we're going to have BRICS summit in Kazan. And we know that Kazan a majority Muslim city. And this is huge, why Russia decided to do that in this particular city. And at the same time, we are hearing that we have a terrorist attack in Dagestan. And it seems that they're trying to draw a line between Muslims and Christians, Jews.
Of course, to begin with, Russia is a remarkably ethnically and religiously diverse country. I think 15-17% of the population is Muslim. There's a significant Jewish population. Russia under Putin is very heavily aligned with the Orthodox Church. So it is a country that champions traditional values against what is called wokeism, namely gender fluidity and other ideas that have taken root in the West, which are opposed by conservatives in the West, which makes a sort of partnership between them and the Russians possible. So that's one dimension of this. Second is that there is, as a result of the effort to sever Russian ties to Europe and to ostracize Russia, Russia has been reoriented not just toward China and India, but toward West Asia, toward the Muslim heartland. And indeed, we're seeing in that heartland very independent policies by more and more countries. I know, for example, that Bahrain, which is where the US Fifth Fleet is ashore, has just decided to renew its diplomatic relationships with Iran. Well, I imagine this is not good news to Washington. Also, as we speak, the Chinese defense minister is in Beijing, developing a more robust defense relationship with China, even as the Biden administration continues to pursue normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel and a stronger defense relationship with Saudi Arabia. So these countries are now engaged, all of them, in more sophisticated games of balance. And Russia is part of this. So that is the second factor. And the third is, Kazan is a very appropriate place. In any event, it's Tatar, as you said, mostly Tatar, very European-looking Muslims, and quite sophisticated. And it's something the Russians will want to show off to the global majority, which is becoming represented in the BRICS. If you go to Moscow, you see mainly a European setting. You go to Kazan and you see something different. And I think this is part of Russian public diplomacy to demonstrate the cosmopolitanism of the Russian population. So I think there are reasons for all of that. And October is quite a few months away now. Plenty of time for the working groups in BRICS to come up with different ideas, which can be discussed and maybe approved, ratified at Kazan.
Yeah. Recently, Emmanuel Macron said that he tries to talk with Putin and his administration, but they're not responding to any sort of communication. And what, in your opinion, why Russia decided not to talk with Macron?
Well, I think Macron has been very aggressive in his posture on Russia, threatening to put the French Foreign Legion into Odessa, for example, talking about freeing up Ukrainians to strike deep into Russia, And he's been more hawkish even than the United States or Great Britain. And I don't think the basis for a talk is there in the Russian view. I would note also that Macron has inherited and is trying to promote the Gaullist heritage of France, but he staked everything on a European identity for France, equating French interests with those of Europe as a whole. And he's just lost the European elections on that issue. And because of war fatigue, Macron may not be around very much longer. He has said he will not resign, even if he loses the national elections that he has called, which most people think he will. Most people believe he will lose. And we will have a parliament dominated by the French right, which has moderated its position on European Union. For example, it has accepted the euro, which it once opposed. So I don't think the Russians would consider this a timely moment to sit down for a discussion with Macron. It probably would help him in the elections. I don't think they want to help him.
Mhm. The United States and European Union decided to send this first tranche of frozen Russian assets to the pocket of the military-industrial complex and to provide Ukraine with weapons. And it seems that Hungary is not happy with the situation because European Union decided to bypass Hungary's opinion on this matter. And even Foreign Minister of Hungary was calling this type of behavior a shameless violation of red lines. And how do you see the situation of Hungary right now within the European Union?
Well, Hungary is about to take the chair, the presidency of the European Union, I think, in a couple of days. And I think it has tried very hard not to get itself into an intractable conflict with other members of the European Union. It compromised on this question. It allowed Europe to do what it did without invoking the requirement for unanimity of decision making. I think Mr. Orban, who speaks Russian and seems very familiar with Russian politics, like his colleague who was the subject of an assassination attempt, Mr. Fico, in Slovakia. And I think he is very much against perpetuating this war. I believe as president of the European Union, he will have some influence because there is a great deal of war fatigue in Europe. But it's really too early to say what will come of all of this.
Yeah. The other thing would be the conflict. When it comes to the conflict in Gaza, we've learned that the Biden administration, when Netanyahu was talking about fighting Hezbollah, the Biden administration said that we're going to support them. Then after 2 days, they said, no, they're not going to support them. We're not going to be there to help you if you go fight Hezbollah. And I'm so confused. Each and everybody is so confused with this type of policy. In your opinion, what's going on between Netanyahu administration and the Biden administration right now?
Well, let's begin by recognizing that neither Israel nor the United States has a strategy. We have no clear, achievable objectives, no estimate of the resources required to achieve such objectives, no strategy for ending the war. Mr. Netanyahu does not want to end the war. He has said to Hamas, the Biden administration has claimed that Netanyahu has endorsed Mr. Biden's so-called peace proposal. But in fact, Mr. Netanyahu has made it very clear that while he would accept a temporary ceasefire in return for hostage release by Hamas, he reserves the right to immediately restart the war once the hostages have been released. He has also said that Israel will hunt down and kill all the Hamas leaders. Now, if you are Hamas, this doesn't sound like a peace proposal. It sounds like more of the same, only even more intense. And that is clearly how most Israelis interpret it. Mr. Netanyahu has also been very critical of the Biden administration, and he has injected himself once again into American domestic politics by apparently accepting an invitation to address the Congress, which was put forward by the Republicans and reluctantly accepted by some, but not all, Democrats. Mr. Netanyahu has also been very active in intervening in American politics. He has interfered in the American elections. We've just had primary elections in New York. His agent, unregistered agent, AIPAC, put $15 million into defeating the incumbent congressman, Democratic Party congressman, in favor of someone who is in favor of Israel rather than critical of it. And finally, it's not clear what the position of the United States is on war with Hezbollah. We've heard both things that you cite. Amos Hochstein, who is, I believe, both an Israeli and an American, but is nonetheless representing the United States in discussions with the Lebanese, apparently told the Lebanese we would back Israel. Other language coming out of Washington has said we have cautioned Israel, we may not be with you. In either case, it appears that we do intend to back Israel, that we have given Israel yet another blank check. And we know from experience that when you give somebody a blank check, if they're an alcoholic, they go and buy a lot of liquor. And if they're Israeli, they go start a war. So we should not be surprised if we, having thrown away all our leverage and assured the Israelis they can do what they want, we should not be surprised if they do what they want. And very often what they want to do ends up being very injurious to us as well as to them. I think I should say one other thing about Lebanon, and that is, if you read the American media, which you cited, you will see a lot of whining about the terrible imposition on Israelis in northern Israel of the need to relocate. 80,000 Israelis, I believe, have been dislocated by the skirmishing along the border with Lebanon. Nobody ever talks about the 90,000 Lebanese who have been dislocated and had to move away from the border because of Israeli bombing and artillery. And so we have a very inaccurate, unbalanced view of the situation. Hezbollah has made it clear from the very beginning that if Israel were to call off the war on the Palestinians, it would cease to fight Israel. There would be a ceasefire. More recently, Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, has pointed out that Israel is using 2 British bases in Cyprus and apparently plans to attack Lebanon from them. And he has warned that if this happens, he will bomb Cyprus. So we have the danger of a wider war on the northern front with Lebanon, as well as with Iran, following up on the tit-for-tat exchange between Israel and Iran after the Israeli bombing of the Iranian embassy in Damascus. This is not a good situation. And I have not mentioned the Houthis, who everybody always says, oh, the Iranian-backed Houthis, as though the fact that they are Iranian-backed explains everything they do. No, they are very independent-minded people. Iran does back them, yes, against Israel. And they are now engaged in an attempted blockade of Israel by obstructing and attacking ships in the Red Sea and more recently the Gulf of Aden. So this is a very complicated situation, and nothing that is happening is making it simpler or more likely to result in a peace agreement.
Yeah. Do you when Russia is talking about they're gonna respond to the United States when they're trying to with whatever Ukrainian army is doing attacking civilians, do you think they're considering helping Houthis to fight the United States, or they're not considering Houthis as a part of
I
the
think
system?
I think they have an interest in not getting crosswise with the Saudis, who do not want the Houthis to be armed to do more damage to shipping in the Red Sea. Let us remember that with American support, the Saudis had worked out a peace agreement with the Houthis, and that peace agreement was supposed to go into effect before the Gaza war began, and the Gaza war has stopped it. But the Saudis have never favored the Houthi blockade in the Red Sea. So I think, I suspect, if he has not already done so, Mr. Putin will have discussed this with Mohammed bin Salman and will defer to the Saudis, who I'm sure would oppose such arms transfers.
Just to wrap up this session, one more question would be, would the United States, we know that right now United States tried to convince Saudi Arabia to offer them a defense treaty in order to normalize their relationship with Israel. But we know that all of these offers are failing right now, it seems to me. And do you see any sort of sign in the behavior of the Biden administration or Netanyahu administration that the situation is totally against Israel right now? The changes that are happening are not in favor of Israel right now and in the future.
Yeah, I think I cannot speak to what Mr. Netanyahu, who seems to be desperate to hold on to his position, even at the great cost to his country, what his actual thinking is. And I don't know what Mr. Biden thinks. I think it's apparent to many other people that Israel has lost this war with the Palestinians. It has failed to destroy Hamas, as it said it would, in a very short period. Hamas is still alive and well. In fact, Hamas has more recruits than ever because of the savagery of the genocide that Israel has conducted in Palestine. It has failed to set aside the Palestinian question, as the so-called Abraham Accords were intended to do, and that question is now very prominent in international affairs and of great interest to many, many countries. And of course, Israel has also done huge damage to its own reputation. It has been charged with probable genocide. It has been ordered to cease and desist the activities that constitute genocide. Its politicians, its leaders, have been indicted for crimes against humanity. And its chief backer, the United States, has been alienated from it in many respects. American young people now have a very different and negative view of Israel than they did before October 7th. So on every level, military, political, and I should add economic, because the Israeli economy has been hollowed out, Israel has lost. If it now adds a war with Hezbollah to its war with the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank, it will lose still more. Whether Mr. Netanyahu cares about that, as opposed to his own personal future, is an open question. But I think the backdrop is should be very disturbing to any Israeli. This could end if war with Hezbollah breaks out and Nasrallah does what he says he will do, blanket Israel as far south as Tel Aviv with rocket fire. And I think he would be joined in that by other countries in the region. Iran would certainly support it. Iraq might. We've just seen an Iraqi group fire at the Israeli port of Eilat. Apparently they didn't hit Eilat, but still, this is a widening conflict. And if you widen it to include Lebanon, it will get wider still. So I think Israel's in a very difficult position. And if it does go ahead with war with Lebanon, I think this might end the whole experiment with Zionism. Which Israelis are going to want to live under rocket barrages all over the country with an army that is at odds with their political leadership and with wars that have no prospect of ending? Many Israeli Jews, at least, perhaps not Palestinians, have ties to other countries. 1.5 million, 2 million have extra passports. So I think this is existential for Israel. And that is the result of decisions that the Israeli government has made and continues to make. It need not have been this way.